We're talking about forest ecosystems because they are an integral part of Oregon Wild's work over the last 50 years. Our mission is to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters. And the wilderness and roadless areas that we've worked to protect over our history are largely in forests. A lot of the wildlife habitat that we advocate for is forested. And the rivers and streams that we seek protection for and advocate for restoration of flow through, you guessed it, forests. So forests make up about half of Oregon, and half of that is on public lands where we work most. So protecting and restoring these healthy forest ecosystems are key to achieving many of our goals. In particular, we do tend to focus a lot on mature and old growth forests that have, for the most part, not been logged extensively and have developed naturally for about a century or more. These forests are important for lots of reasons. I'm just going to go over them very briefly because you either already know this, heard us talk about it, or you can get more information on other webcasts. But they are important for many wildlife species, not just the ones on the endangered species list that we mentioned already. These forests also help protect and filter our watersheds, providing clean drinking water and fish habitat. Mature and old growth forests have also evolved with fire and have adaptations that make them more resistant and resilient in the face of this natural disturbance. They also just improve our quality of life in immeasurable ways, helping us get outside and experience the joys of nature. And perhaps one of the most important reasons that we focus on them is that they do sequester and store vast amounts of carbon, making them one of our most vital natural climate solutions. And you will hear a lot more about that from Lauren. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about two different scales of forest plans and policies. So I want to just give a glimpse of what those are really quick. So across the country, there are 188 million acres of national forests. You can see them on this map here in the brighter green color. They're found in 40 different states, and all of those national forests are managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Now, here in Oregon, we have about 16 million acres of national forests. And here on this public lands map, you can see national forests shown in green. And there's other public lands across Oregon, but we're going to be focused on those on national forests tonight. And then when we talk about the Northwest Forest Plan, and I'll show this map a little bit later too, we're talking about national forests, another subset in Western Oregon, Western Washington, and Northwest California. So there's a map here that shows the national forests that are included in the Northwest Forest Plan area. So we're talking about forest plans. So just a very small amount of background here to root us in what we're talking about there. Forest plans are required under federal law for all national forests. They may not be the most foremost on your mind when you're out enjoying a hiking trail or camping or rafting on public lands. However, these forest plans actually define and affect the uses that are allowed in different areas of national forests, from recreation to logging. And they also impact where wildlife habitat is defined, how waterways are managed, and as well as other ecosystems that are found in our forests. They're essentially zoning plans for the national forest. In Oregon, most of our forest plans were completed in about 1989-90. And they were intended to be revised every 15 years or so, or when conditions significantly changed. Well, one reason we're here talking about forest plan amendments tonight is because one of the biggest significant changes that our forests face today is climate change. It's kind of the root of much of what we'll talk about tonight. Okay. So if I haven't lost you yet, we're going to dive into talking about the Northwest Forest Plan and what's being proposed right now and why it's important. So I just mentioned how forest plans were put in place in Oregon at around 1990. And while there hasn't been an official revision to that plan in the 30 plus years since, There was actually a pretty major amendment that was superimposed over those initial plans in the form of the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994. So at that time, decades of logging and road building in our national forests had led to massive habitat destruction, and old growth forest and stream dependent species in the Pacific Northwest were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And that's right, we are talking about the northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, and several Pacific salmon species. You can see in this satellite image from the 90s, section of the Willamette National Forest, and all of the bright white spots are clear cuts and pretty fresh ones at that. So you can see, and you can see the border with the Three Sisters Wilderness and where logging wasn't allowed, and just the vast difference. And you can see maybe why some of these species were having trouble surviving. So the Northwest Forest Plan was a compromise that was developed as an attempt to strike a balance between this ongoing logging and protecting habitat for the species for these species that they needed to survive. The plan covered 24 million acres of federal forests in Western Washington, Western Oregon, and Northwest California, again, and you can see the map there of all of the forests that were included. And then the map on the right just focuses on Oregon, and you can see that zoning scheme that kind of is an indicator of forest plans. And I don't expect you to be able to pick out certain areas or get into the nitty gritty here, but in essence, the forest plan defined areas for protecting and restoring old growth habitat, and those were late successional reserves. It set aside streamside areas or riparian reserves to protect water quality and salmon habitat. It set direction for restoring forests and watersheds that have been previously logged, especially in those reserve areas. And then it also set targets and areas called matrix for ongoing timber harvest. The plan took a landscape approach to connecting these large, actually I'll go back, to connecting these large reserves for protection and recovery of old forest habitat conditions. And the network of stream buffers was meant to be just that, a network across the landscape. A couple of other key provisions that are listed here is that it included watershed analysis and an aquatic conservation strategy, as well as a requirement to look for rare species that might be impacted by old growth logging. It was called the Survey and Manage Mitigation Measures. And one key thing to note also is that because this was crafted around the range of the northern spotted owl, it also included lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management in Western Oregon, which is about 2.5 million acres. And I'll go back real quick. And that's a lot of the checkerboard land up and down the length of I-5 in Southwest Oregon. So Oregon Wild's generally been a pretty big supporter of the Northwest Forest Plan. For one, it immediately slowed old growth liquidation that had been happening. It brought improved management to many of our federal forests. And in the 30 years that it's been in place, it's led to some great progress in restoring some of the damage done by unsustainable logging of previous decades. Water quality and salmon habitat has improved in many areas, and the Forest Service is largely meeting their timber production targets, not by logging old growth anymore, but by thinning and previously clear-cut plantations, in some cases to add diversity and regrow old growth habitat. And maybe most important, this last point on the slide, because the old growth logging stopped and young forests were allowed to grow, the carbon that was being emitted into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change from all this logging in the Pacific Northwest, actually switched from being a source of carbon to a sink for carbon, which in the grand scheme of things is pretty powerful. Unfortunately, the Northwest Forest Plan is also not perfect. I mentioned it was a compromise. Not all of our remaining mature and old growth forests were included in those reserve areas, and logging of those forests are still allowed in matrix, which covers millions of acres. Logging and road building is also still allowed in many ecologically critical areas, including municipal watersheds, unroaded areas, and forests that are recovering from fire. The plan also placed pretty high expectations on timber production from these public lands. So I wanted to give you a quick example of some areas that are still at risk and why the plan that Lauren's going to talk about is so important. So you may have heard of the Flat Country project on the Willamette National Forest or the Grasshopper project on the Mount Hood. Oregon Wild's been involved in sort of battling those projects for a number of years, and you might have seen alerts about them. Both are logging projects that are within the Northwest Forest Plan area that include logging old forests because they happen to be in those matrix areas where it's allowed. Now, we don't think because we can is a good enough reason to log our few remaining older forests. And so we've worked on finding plenty of good arguments to push back on these projects through litigation and through grassroots pressure. Flat Country was withdrawn a year ago, and Grasshopper is currently pending due to our lawsuit. But I want to point out on this map, this is a map of the sort of land use allocations under the forest plan in the Flat Country area. And you can see that the little green areas are they're very small reserve areas because there are historically spotted owls living there. And there's a few other like scenic retention areas that are delineated here. This is the edge of the wilderness, or this is the wilderness area. And then all of this sort of like peach color that holds it all together is matrix in this particular area. And that's why they were allowed to plan logging throughout this area, including in old forests. So it's not that we're not, not in support of changing the plan, because there definitely is room for improvement. There's also a lot of changes that have happened in the last 30 years that we think need to be considered as, in forest management plans as we move forward. So, for example, we know a lot more about climate change now and the important role that forests can play in storing carbon and adapting to climate change. There's also barred owls that have moved into spotted owl habitat and is threatening, to outcompete them, which means owls need a lot more habitat and connections between patches of old growth forest. And then the fact that the Bureau of Land Management actually isn't participating in the original framework of the Northwest Forest Plan anymore. So, room for improvement. We could actually protect all of the remaining mature and old growth forests that are out there on this landscape. We could have more of a focus on ecological restoration, enhance riparian protections even more, and definitely need to incorporate the importance of forests in climate change. And, the forest plan didn't really do a whole lot to protect forests recovering from fire. And we know that logging after fire can be really damaging. So there's opportunities for improvement. What's being proposed now is pretty interesting. So actually, I want to go back real quick. I guess I don't have a slide for this, but I wanted to note that over the years we have, even though we've found parts of the plan that aren't perfect, over the years we've definitely gone to bat to defend several key provisions of the Northwest Forest Plan that help protect wildlife and streams, including the survey and manage program that I mentioned earlier. We've been successful in fending off some of the weakened protections, but one major loss was the BLM's new management plans, which essentially removed 2 million acres from the conservation framework of the Northwest Forest Plan, shrinking riparian reserves to just half of their previous size, and allowing more intensive logging both inside and outside of reserve areas. So it's just a key note that while the plan hasn't necessarily been amended, there have been attacks on it and some of the provisions that we like. Okay, so what's being proposed now? So there were some initial efforts to revise forest plans in the Northwest Forest Plan region back in the 20 teens, and those were eventually put on pause. Then last year, a federal advisory committee was convened to inform potential amendments to forest plans in this area. Now, after several months of work, the Forest Service has released a notice of an amendment proposal that would focus in 5 key areas: wildfire risk, climate change, old growth forests, tribal engagement, and rural communities and workforce. And what I have on the slide right now is the actual language from the official notice. The Forest Service is citing that there are changed ecological and social conditions, which makes sense. And there's also substantial new information regarding recovery plans and critical habitat for spotted owls, as well as executive orders that have come out over the last few years around forest and climate change. So this is kind of the framework for where they want to make some plan amendments. But it's quite vague, and we have some concerns. I do want to note that one very important change that's being proposed is that the amendment they're coming up with right now actually applies to more national forests than just what was in the original Northwest Forest Plan area. That includes more forests in Northern California and the Klamath region and Eastern Cascades. Those tend to be drier, more fire-dependent forest ecosystems. Quite different from the moisture forest, where that includes most of the spotted owl's habitat range. So what are our concerns? Well, some of the proposed amendments language could be interpreted as positive, but again, it's really vague and leaves a lot of room for Forest Service discretion that could weaken current protections when we know we need to see increased protections especially for mature and old growth forests. The fact that there's more dry forests included in this amendment means we're concerned that the Forest Service might be exploiting fear of fire, use it as an excuse to log forests that have evolved with this natural disturbance. And it could lead to more logging in mature forests under the guise of fuel reduction. We're also concerned that while the Forest Plan Amendment, as it's written in this notice, acknowledges the need to address climate change and mentions President Biden's executive order on the subject, it doesn't actually talk much about the urgent need for carbon storage or sequestration, and we'd like to see that prioritized more. Okay, so I'm going to, I think that's my last slide. It's not actually. This is just an example of some just concerns that we have that could come up under this plan. We're still seeing road building that cut through old growth forests. We're still seeing post-fire logging, and we're seeing a lot more logging proposed in dry forests in the name of fire risk reduction when the science doesn't say that is what needs to be done. So these forests are still at risk. And I think Lauren will address one way that we might address these concerns. I will, before I turn it over to Lauren, mention that if you have questions, go ahead and enter those into the Q&A bubble, and we will get to them in a few minutes.
Thanks so much, Chandra. Hey, everybody. My name's Lauren Anderson, and I'm the Climate Forest Program Manager here at Oregon Wild. So to kick things off, I'm going to give a little bit of a background on the campaign behind the recent old growth announcement that came out, and then I'm going to dive into what we're actually hoping to get out of this process. So next slide. So this campaign, the Climate Forest Campaign, is very narrowly focused on one goal. We want to establish a new federal rule, like the roadless rule that was established a couple decades ago, that protects mature and old growth forests from the threat of logging across all federal lands. And with this specific goal in mind, a number of organizations came together to launch the campaign at the beginning of 2022. And the groups that launched this campaign are, the usual suspects: Sierra Club, NRDC, Earth Justice, along with a couple regional groups, including Oregon Wild. So the launch of this campaign was a big deal and really exciting to see so much momentum around a future rulemaking. Pretty much 2 months after the campaign launched, President Biden issued an executive order calling for protection for mature and old growth forests across all federal lands. And this campaign has pretty much been a roller coaster ever since then. Next slide. So, a quick recap of why the executive order was such a big deal. So, the executive order covered both mature and old growth forests, which was a really big deal for us because a lot of old growth has been logged here in Oregon. And the best way to recover that old growth is to protect our future old growth, which is mature forests. And in addition to that, the president's executive order covered both BLM lands and national forests, which, as Chandra mentioned, is a really big deal here in Oregon because we have a lot of forests that don't have strong enough protections on BLM lands. And the other last piece of this that was a huge deal was that it was framed as a climate solution. So when the Climate Forest campaign launched, our goal was to elevate old growth forests and mature forests as a critical climate solution. And so when people think of addressing the threat of climate change, things like solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles come to mind. And we want an old growth tree to come to mind as well when you start thinking of those solutions. So overall, this was a really big deal. Following the executive order that next year, the Forest Service, after much dragging of their feet, issued some definitions and inventory in alignment with the requirements of the EO. These definitions were not very useful. They were extremely complicated and varied, and so they're very hard to apply on the ground. And then the maps and inventory that they issued were very high level, and so they're hard to use on the ground to accurately describe where the old growth trees are. Following the definitions and inventory, we finally had a breakthrough on this campaign where the Forest Service issued an advance notice of a proposed rule. And this was a really big turning point for us. Logging was unfortunately downplayed as a threat to these forests. However, we got over 500,000 comments from around the country into this advance notice of the proposed rulemaking and basically broke every system and made it very clear that what we wanted was a rule that protected these forests from the threat of logging. So following that, this last November, the Forest Service released a threat assessment, which was yet another requirement under the EEO. And in this threat assessment, they finally recognized that logging was a threat to mature and old growth forests, which was a huge breakthrough. And then following this threat assessment, we started to hear rumblings that there was going to be an actual policy development on mature and old growth forest protections. Next slide. So it turns out that the Forest Service actually was not able to ignore 500,000 comments from across the country. And on December, right before the holidays, the Forest Service announced a new nationwide forest plan amendment to protect old growth forests. Now, this is a really big deal. They've never done anything like this before. They've never done a nationwide amendment. It's one of the biggest developments in forest policy in the last 25 years since the roadless rule. It's going to amend all 128 forest plans from across the country. And if a forest plan contains language that is more restrictive on old growth logging, then the new policy, the more restrictive language, is going to continue to govern. So strongest policy rules. In addition to this announcement of the old growth amendment, the deputy chief of the Forest Service also sent out a letter to all regional foresters requiring interim review of any logging project that includes old growth trees, which is a big deal because it creates a serious political barrier to them ever doing a project like flat country again. So here's the timeline for what we're working with. So far, USDA has issued a notice of intent, which is basically like a preliminary proposal. The purpose of the current comment period is to shape the full proposal, a draft EIS, environmental impact statement, which is coming out at the end of May, beginning of June. This first comment period is going to be 45 days. Deadline is February 2nd. And then the second comment period is going to be 90 days with a deadline in August. After the close of this second comment period in August, USDA is going to finalize the policy and it will be released the beginning of 2025. So the big asterisk overhanging this whole process is the fact that that's if President Biden gets reelected. So next slide. So what outcomes are we looking for in this? This is a big opportunity, but the reality is that we still have our work cut out for us. The amendment would still allow for numerous exceptions for commercial logging of old growth trees, which is a big no-no in our book. And it does nothing to protect mature forests. As we've discussed earlier, protecting mature forests is absolutely critical to recovering old growth and to addressing things like the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. So we absolutely need those to be in the conversation. Next slide. We really want to get over 100,000 comments in to this comment period. And with the following big comment period over the summer, our goal is to break our record of 500,000. So we need to ensure during this comment period now that we have strong alternatives in the EIS that's published over the summer. So here are some of the things we're pushing for. We want to put an end to old growth trees being cut down, except where there's a threat to life or property, like if the old growth tree is hanging over a electrical wire or something like that. But those exceptions are extremely rare. We also want extremely tight controls on any management in old growth stands. So some management and restoration is okay, but again, you can't cut down the biggest, largest trees to make projects pencil out financially. That practice has to stop. We want to completely eliminate the commercial exchange of old growth trees, so no financial incentives to log, because that undermines the whole point of this. We want definitions that are fully inclusive of all old growth conditions. They have to be simple and clear and easy to apply in the field so that people can ensure that old growth trees are being protected on the ground. And we really want stronger language on mature forests, so a meaningful pathway to actually protecting the old growth of the future. We also need strong monitoring and accountability measures as part of this. So we need to be able to show and demonstrate that we're recovering mature and old growth forests across the landscape. And we need to be able to show that we're increasing carbon sequestration, that this climate solution is working. We also want accountability to actually account for community benefits like clean water and access to outdoor recreation. There's a host of benefits associated with old growth, and we need to make sure communities receive those benefits. And just to reiterate, this amendment, while it's a very big deal, is ultimately just a stepping stone for us to get towards that big national rule that protects mature and old growth. Next slide. So we have not forgotten about the Bureau of Land Management. This nationwide amendment is for Forest Service, so it applies to national forests, not BLM forests. And we are working to ensure that BLM lands here in Western Oregon stay in the national conversation. So BLM in conversations has seemed more open than the Forest Service to protections for forests, but we haven't seen the follow through yet. During the comment period this last summer, the BLM initiated a parallel policy process, which they're calling their BLM conservation rule. So the conservation rule is incredibly broad and very high level, and it's basically attempting to reset the stage at the agency to ensure that conservation and recreation are on equal footing with things like mining, grazing, oil and gas leasing, which are the practices that the BLM is very much known for. So we expect this conservation rule to have language on mature and old growth forests and the value they provide, which is good. However, we don't expect the rule to have any binding regulatory language that we could actually use to enforce better management on the ground, which is what we are after. So next slide. So this is what we're after and what we're asking for from the BLM. We want them to incorporate strong monitoring and evaluation measures in the rule itself. Even if they're not including regulatory language, they should at least have these accountability measures in place. And we want to ensure that any policies they develop, including this rule, apply to all BLM lands, and they can't leave forests here in the Pacific Northwest out of the national conversation. And beyond the conservation rule itself, we want them to commit to initiating a future rulemaking to establish durable protections. So in addition, while we're waiting for that future rule to be established, we want them to issue interim guidance that clearly spells out that logging of mature and old growth forests is not okay and needs to stop. And we want them to mirror the Forest Service in establishing an elevated review process for all mature and old growth logging projects so that that strong political barrier is in place as a rule is developed. And that's it for BLM rule. Next slide. Great.
Okay, great. Thank you. I love that Lauren and her team are thinking so big picture and strategically. It's exciting. So now we get into what you can do specifically on these two amendment processes during this comment period. And I know there's some questions about what we can do like more broadly, and we'll get to those. But so I'm going to start with the Northwest Forest Plan, and then we'll go to the nationwide old growth amendment as well. So you may have seen Oregon Wild or other groups email alerts asking you to sign on to a petition or to submit comments through our form. And we really want to thank you for taking those actions if you've already done that. We are hoping that many of you here this evening will actually go one step further. So while every name added to our petition is important and demonstrates the popular support behind protecting our forests, the Forest Service is placing and always places a high value on personalized and unique comments that can be submitted through its website. So here's what we're asking you to do. For the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment, you can, I have the information here for submitting a comment through Oregon Wild, and there's an Take Action page on our website with a pre-written letter, which you are welcome to customize, although there's a word limit and you have to like delete some if you want to add stuff. However, we also really want you to draft and submit your own letter. You can write a comment in your own words about why you value Pacific Northwest forests and the role they play in storing carbon, providing salmon and wildlife habitat, filtering clean water, and supporting a diverse and sustainable economy. There's a short link here that will take you directly to the Forest Service website where you can submit your comment. You can either type your text into a box in the form, or you can attach a document, a Word document, or a PDF, whatever. It's fairly straightforward. And if anybody has questions about it afterwards, you can email me or Lauren about it. Here's a couple of talking points to consider for your comments on the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment. We definitely want to ask for protecting all mature and old growth so they're not left in the logging areas. We think that they should prioritize carbon storage and sequestration. The focus of fire risk reduction, which they're talking about heavily in this amendment, should be on community preparedness and not logging. We want more reserve areas for habitat and ecosystem health, especially because BLM lands are not integrated into the Northwest Forest Plan anymore. And we want to make sure that the amendment process is transparent and takes the time it needs to really involve tribes. There's some concern that this is moving really quickly towards some, predetermined end, and there's just lip service being paid to actual tribal engagement. So there's just a couple of ideas. And again, there's a blog post and an action alert on Oregon Wild's website if you want those resources as well. Okay. Lauren, how about for the National Old Growth Amendment?
So we have two options here for submitting comments. You can sign our petition, which is on our website. The link is here. Or you can also draft and submit your own comment. And like Chandra said earlier, having those personalized messages that really focus on the values you care most about are really important to get across to the Forest Service. They very much value those individual comments over the petition style comments that we send in. Both have value, but if you have time, sending in a comment would be fantastic. So the talking points we're focusing on for this, in addition to sort of the goals that I highlighted earlier, just to be clear, we should not be selling old growth trees on public lands. End of story. We need to protect mature forests and trees. Mature forests are the old growth of the future. They are incredibly important from a biodiversity and climate perspective. And we absolutely need big solutions. The agency should not be taking incremental steps towards some future outcome that we're going to see in 20 years. We need big solutions that match the magnitude of the big threats we're facing today. This is a critical natural climate solution. The agencies do not like talking about carbon and climate because it gives us a very strong case for protecting these trees. And so they try very hard to leave it out of the conversation. So reinserting that is very important going forward. And also, we just need to act boldly. This is one of the biggest developments on climate and forest policy we've had in a very long time. This is a huge opportunity. We absolutely need to get the most out of it that we possibly can. And I want to touch briefly on sort of the overlap between these two big policies. So we're hearing that the nationwide amendment is likely on a faster timeline than the Northwest Forest Plan revisions. So whatever protections are established under the nationwide amendment will hold until the Northwest Forest Plan finalizes their own plan revisions or their own amendment process. And if the Northwest Forest Plan comes out with stronger language on mature and old growth forests than was in the nationwide amendment, then that stronger language will hold. So both processes are incredibly important. I think that's everything.
Awesome, thank you. On the last slide here, a very important notice, and we got a couple questions. The comments for both are due on February 2nd, so next Friday. Amazing how that lined up, right? And we have lots of other great questions. So I've jotted down a few, and I'm sorting through a few that are just coming in, so bear with me. And to answer a couple easy questions, the video recording of this webinar, as well as the links for taking action, will be on our website tomorrow under the blog section of the Oregon Wild website. So you can click on the links that way, because I know it can be a little hard to jot them down. We tried to make them small, but and I can go back to those if it's helpful. And that answers a bunch of people's questions. Great. Okay. So let's see. Lauren, thanks for touching on how these two plans intersect. There were a couple of questions about how either of these intersect with the planned Blue Mountains Forest Plan revision. And I wonder if you could take that.
So the nationwide amendment will it will apply to every forest plan across the country. So there are 128 plans across the entire country, including Blue Mountains. So that when the nationwide amendment falls into place, and hopefully we get the strongest protections possible, it will protect old growth trees and mature forests in that plan. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I guess to be a little more specific, I know that the actually, well, it's always funny to like scroll back through a bunch of slides, but so I won't do that. But so in Oregon, the Northwest Forest Plan forests that would be subject to this amendment are mostly the Ochoco National Forest and West, including the Fremont Wainema National Forest, Deschutes National Forest, and then the ones that Willamette, Mount Hood, Umpqua, Siuslaw, Rogue River, Siskiyou. But to the east of that, the Blue Mountains include the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, Umatilla National Forest, and Malheur National Forest. Those are part of the Blue Mountains Plan revision, which is just getting started. So they're kind of lumping those together, just like they're lumping all of the stuff in the Northwest Forest Plan plus area together. And as Lauren said, any nationwide forest plan amendment would, especially if it has stronger protections for old growth, would apply to all of these forest plans. So hopefully that helps.
I
Let's
see
Mhm.
another question here that I can jump on, Chandra. So there's a question on here on if President Biden can secure a new plan that could not be undone by a different president. So that is a great question. So unfortunately, when the next president after Biden takes office, they also are given executive powers and are able to make decisions like executive orders. However, a rulemaking process like what we're advocating for here, including this nationwide amendment that is going forward, because it goes through a full NEPA process with EIS, with alternatives, and public comment period, those are actually much harder to undo than an executive action taken by the president. So this administrative action through the nationwide amendment is going to basically hold unless the agency decides to go through an equally long and involved process of undoing it, which is a lot of time and money and effort to do. So it can be undone, but it would be extremely hard to undo. And the reason that we are advocating for a rule on top of the nationwide amendment is because a rule is actually going to be an even harder process to undo going forward. So this amendment, as it applies to each plan, can be amended in the future through future plan revisions. Whereas like a national rulemaking would not be up to each individual forest to tinker with down the road. So
Awesome. Thank you for that. There were a couple questions about under the Northwest Forest Plan about the BLM, because I mentioned how they are not a part of the Northwest Forest Plan anymore. I didn't go into much detail there, but yeah, there was it's a long and sordid history of legal action by the timber industry claiming that BLM lands in Oregon can't be protected from logging because their sole purpose should be for logging. And so through a series of settlements from those lawsuits, the BLM did a whole new management plan, much like the original forest plans for their lands alone. And they're different than the Northwest Forest Plan. Shrunk riparian reserves, allowed for more intense logging than what was allowed in many cases. It was something that we battled for a long time. And if anyone was around, we called it WOPR, the Western Oregon Plan Revision. And so that's why they're not currently part of the Northwest Forest Plan. There was, like I said, there was litigation for years. So it's kind of settled at the moment, though there's still opportunity through the BLM conservation rule that Lauren mentioned to get the BLM to do the right thing in some of these older forests. There's also a couple of questions about why the boundary change, adding in additional forests under the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment. And that's a question, honestly, for the Federal Advisory Committee and the Forest Service. I'm not quite sure. I think the most likely reason is because they're trying to align these amendments with another big national policy, the wildfire crisis strategy. I think I have that right, which has new direction for addressing the threat of wildfire to our forests and communities. And so they wanted to be able to amend forest plans based on that direction under that new national strategy. I'm not an expert on it, so I can't speak exactly to what it says, but I think that's the reason.
I see another question in here about the Oregon's Western Habitat Conservation Plan. I'm assuming you're talking about the Habitat Conservation Plan on Oregon's state forest, which is undergoing, the HCP is undergoing a process right now with quite a bit of opposition. So this is a separate process and it applies to Oregon's state forests as opposed to federal forests, which is what the Northwest Forest Plan and this nationwide amendment is focused on. However, Habitat Conservation Plan process here in Oregon is also very important for ensuring there are protected areas to help threatened and endangered species. There's even less old growth left on our state forest land. So please do everything you can to participate in that process.
Great point. And yeah, folks got folks in the Eugene area at least might have gotten a notice to come and testify at a meeting in Eugene. Speaking of meetings in Eugene, there was also a question about giving oral comment in person at the Federal Advisory Committee meeting happening next week in Eugene. That is the advisory committee for the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment, and they've been meeting periodically, and indeed next week that will happen in Eugene. There's a public comment opportunity on the first day of the meeting. I think you already need to have signed up to comment, and that's definitely a great way of addressing the committee and letting them know that what you care about. However, it's not an official comment on this scoping and during the scoping period, and so I wouldn't say one's more important than the other, but definitely get a comment in because it actually goes on the record. It's definitely okay to do both. And also, if you've already signed one of our petitions or, clicked on anyone's, comment form, it's also okay to submit your own comment, as we're urging you to do here. It just makes it more personal, and, they'll see your name twice, but there might be different issues addressed, and that's totally okay.
I can answer question towards the top about old growth and resistance to fire.
Oh, yes, great. That's a good one.
So as trees develop into old growth, their bark becomes thicker, and then they naturally begin to have higher canopies that are higher up off the ground. So when those ground fires go through the forest at the base, old growth trees do tend to be more resistant. It's not true in every single ecosystem in all forests across the country, but overall, old growth forests are more resistant to the threat of wildfire, which is a benefit.
Yeah, and I think, the question was also included, we have these more drought fueled and wind fueled fires. And, in some circumstances, it's true that nothing's going to stop those. We've seen that. Old growth can burn in those situations just like any other forest. However, in less extreme conditions, and if we manage to get the climate crisis under control, they definitely are more resistant. They're moister. There's all sorts of reasons why they can withstand fire better. See, there's a fun question that, well, I like because of the term, but someone asked why we're referring to mature and old growth forests, because it's saying it sounds kind of industrial and, forestry based instead of ancient forests, which sounds more spiritual and charismatic. And I agree. I wrote a book called Oregon's Ancient Forests. However, the scientists use the terms mature and old growth, the agencies use those terms. And Lauren, I think there was even some polling done on what appeals to people and what people most understand. And I think those are a lot of the reasons why we use mature and old growth. I do love the term ancient forest, however.
I mean, we obviously agree. Ancient forest is a great term. But the polling that we did was actually really surprising in the fact that when you talk to people who don't have a background on these issues and don't spend a lot of time in forests, that when you talk about a mature forest, they still put a lot of value on it versus a very young forest. So people get it, and they get the connection between mature and old growth, which is why we use those terms.
Okay, that might be the majority of the questions. There is a question about we say how forests are so important for storing and sequestering carbon, and there's other folks who say that that we can store more carbon in lumber and building materials. However, there's plenty of research that's been done that shows that logging actually releases a lot more carbon into the atmosphere than is stored over any period of time in things like actual wood products and homes. So, and in addition, forests might be storing tons of carbon and sequestering it but they're also providing habitat and cleaning our water and, you know, filtering our air and all those other benefits that we need from our forests. So while of course we still need to build houses, that's not a climate solution. All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you everybody for attending. And again, we will be posting this video along with the links that you can click on to submit your own comment. I apologize if I didn't cut and paste them properly into the chat. So they will be on our website tomorrow, and you'll get an email about all of this. And please take action, speak up for our forests, and there'll be more opportunities when, as both of these amendments move forward, probably this summer, to submit additional comments when we have more details. And it's important to keep showing up at these things, and we thank you all very much for doing so.
Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks.